Stop. Communism does not work. Okay? Just stop. No. Don't do it. Hey guys, it's Mickey. I'm here to show you why communism doesn't work. So I wrote this paper. It's Communism versus Capitalism. And my thesis: throughout the Cold War, communism was shown to have the upper hand. However, capitalism is technically the better economy, and they just waited for the perfect time to strike. Now, the history of communism, because I can't explain communism versus capitalism without the history of it. So basically, the history of communism goes back not as far as capitalism does. So the first country to become a communist country is obviously Russia. They became a communist country back in the 20th century. The year was 1917, and this was close to the end of the First World War. Vladimir Lenin was the original leader of the communist country of Russia. Now, he brought out the idea of communism into the country, and people just wanted a change, so they followed it. Lenin came at the right time because their economy was going down, and they're like, we can't do this anymore, we need something different. If he would have just started talking about it before the First World War, then they probably wouldn't have had a communist country. The people would have just been like, no, the economy works the way it is, we're okay. So the people actually would have been worried about the Germans than their economy. They would have been shut down, and it would have been failed communist revolution. Now, the history of capitalism is a little different. The history of capitalism, it's kind of more well known, and it started way back. So it first started in the 16th century with Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and James Stewart. They were the original three people who brought up the idea of a political economy. Now, small sections of capitalism existed in the ancient world, and flourishing pockets of capitalism were present during the later European Middle Ages. So the development of capitalism was boosted by the growth of the English cloth industry during the 16th through the 18th centuries. Modern capitalism, as we know it, started as a result of the breakdown of the feudal system and the impact of the Protestant Reformation and the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Alright, so now I'm going to give you some more background information on capitalism and communism. We're going to start with communism. Now, communism is an economic system where the government owns and controls most of the production and decides the location of resources and what products and services will be given. Now, the most important people of communism were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Like the socialists before them, they wanted to end oppression of the many for the few. The capitalist system at that time required workers to do work under dangerous conditions for very little pay. Now, the end goal of communism was to get rid of classes among people. And, you know, everyone had equal parts and the riches of society, and the government would no longer be needed. People just worked for the government and the country itself. Now, Karl Marx agreed with Louis Blanc, a French politician, a socialist, favored reforms. He called for the creation of cooperatives in order to guarantee employment for the urban poor. Now, he agreed with him in how labor and income should be controlled, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Karl Marx. However, it seems clear in history that Adam Smith, best known for his classic treatise and inquiry into nature and causes of the wealth of nations, had the better idea, which is that people work for themselves. Marx and Engels believed that there was a class struggle between the majority of the people, which Marx referred to as proletarian, workers or working class people regarded collectively, often used with the reference of Marxism. They would only offer their labor and the owners of their means of production, which included land, raw materials, tools, machine, and mainly money. So they wouldn't give up their product and services without getting all this other stuff in return. Now, Capitalism is an economic system where private companies own the factories of the product, and they own the factors as well. Now, the four factors are entrepreneurship, capital goods, natural resources, and labor. Now, the owners of the capital goods, natural resources, and entrepreneurship use control through the companies. A single person owns his or her labor. Now, the only exception is slavery, where someone else owns another person's labor. Although illegal, slavery is still widely practiced. Now, the capitalistic ownership means two things. First, the owners control the factors of the product. And second, they gain their money through their ownership. Now, that gives them the capability to operate their companies correctly. It also gives them with the incentive to maximize profit. Incentive is why many capitalists say greed is good. Now, in cooperations, the shareholders own. Now, their level of control, the shareholders, depends on how many shares they own. The shareholders elect board of directors. They hire chief executives to manage the company. Now, capitalism requires a free market economy to succeed. It hands out goods and services according to the laws of supply and demand. So, the law of demand says that when demand increases for a product, the price also rises. Now, when competitors realize that they can make a higher profit, they increase production. The greater supply reduces the prices to a level where only the best competitors remain. The owners of the supply compete against each other for the highest profit. They sell their goods at the highest possible price while keeping their costs as low as possible as well, to make sure they still get their product bought by people. Now, competition keeps prices moderate and production efficient. Another component of capitalism is the free work of the capital markets. That means the laws of supply and demand set fair prices for stocks, bonds, derivatives, currencies, and commodities. Now, capital markets allowed for companies to raise funds to expand. Companies dispute profits among the owners, and they include investors, stockholders, and private owners. The laissez-faire economy theory says that government should take a hands-off approach to capitalism. They should only intervene to maintain a level playing field. Now, the government's role is to protect the free market. It should prevent the unfair advantages obtained by the monopolies and oligarchies. It ought to prevent the manipulation of information, making sure it is distributed equally. Now I'm going to get into where they actually started clashing. So, after World War II, America became severely afraid of the control of the Soviet communism. This fear was not helped by the news, media, and politicians who showed the Soviets bent on world domination. In an average communist country, the people were not allowed to own land, speak, or act on their own. Americans were afraid that Soviets would gain power in the U.S. and take away their freedoms. Harry Truman established containment towards the Soviet Union. The idea was not to fight against the Soviets, but to keep them from pushing their boundaries. America leaders believed that the Soviets were geared to push its belief and control in the rest of the world. After the Soviets created the atomic bomb, with the help of stolen intel from the U.S., some politicians, like Joseph McCarthy, began to seek out supposed communists in the U.S. This brought forth the execution of spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. Now, the heat of the war started in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, announced by President Harry Truman. It didn't specifically say, yet it implied that it was pointed toward the USSR. Now, the policy was that any country was threatened by a larger country, it would obviously be supported by the US. Now, in 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which Grant talked about before, was formed. NATO was an organization that was made to be accounted to the Warsaw Pact, and it originally held 12 countries. These included the US, the UK, France, Italy, Canada, and other West European countries. Now, the agreement stated that if any one of the countries were attacked, the others would send their forces. It's kind of like the Truman Doctrine, but for tight-grouped allies. So then, in 1950, the first official military action was brought towards the war. And yet, it was still not between the Soviets and the US. It was actually the USSR who invaded North Korea and put in a communist government in place. But soon after, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, sent its troops into South Korea. As a capitalist nation, having it be overrun by communism wouldn't be so good. So, President Harry Truman sent American soldiers over to help Korea, and the Korean War began. This is one of the few times where the Cold War became a supposed warm war. A warm war is when the armies are ready to fight, and they're waiting. However, there is still a chance for peace and a quick stop to the war. Although a ceasefire was signed in 1953, and American troops mostly left soon after, tensions remained high for a long time as a result. Now in 1958, the space race began, which Alex talked about before. Now the space race was when the US and the USSR tried to attain various space-related accomplishments. The space race halted in 1969, and the US won by getting Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Okay, now I'm going to go back a little bit and explain the fall of communism. Or at least the fall of the USSR. Now, way back in 1955, the Vietnam started. Vietnam War. South Vietnam was an ally to the US, while North Vietnam was an ally to USSR. Much like in Korea, the US government was trying to retain a capitalist foothold and prevent the spread of communism. However, unlike Korea, public approval of our involvement dropped the longer our troops was there. And after 20 years or so, no one really wanted it anymore. Now, all the way over in Europe, things weren't too good. In the 1950s, many Eastern Germans suffered from food shortages, low pay, poor shelter, and 25% of the money that was made went straight to the Soviet Union. So the Germans said that this could simply be solved by moving to West Germany. But now, East Germany had a poor economy, and they couldn't afford to lose any more valuable workers, so they put up the barbed wire fence. That clearly didn't stop the Germans, though. Now, by 1961, 3 million people have immigrated over to West Germany from East Germany. So, the government constructed a large, around 13-foot tall wall to separate the countries. It was called the Berlin Wall. Now, in 1972, both of the Soviet and the US leaders signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which basically stated that both countries would promise not to make nuclear missiles anymore. This decreased the threat of the nuclear war, and in 1989 the Berlin Wall was torn down, and then finally in 1991, Soviet Union was no more. The war had ended. How do you like that? Clearly, communism doesn't work. Anyway, thanks for watching. Any questions?